Hey guys, welcome to your first set of notes for chapter 29. We're going to be talking flowers and flowering plants this chapter, and it's going to be a good time, so let's jump right into it. You guys have known since you were just little kids that honeybees pollinate flowers, and that honeybees eat, what's inside of flowers and stuff like that, nectar, pollen, things of that nature. And that's pretty common knowledge, but your book starts with this chapter with a little story about honeybees and how important they are. Angiosperms, one of the reasons they're so successful, these flowering plants, is that they have pollinators who give them more genetic diversity and spread pollen from one flower to another. And a lot of angiosperms rely on honeybees. Not all of them, but a lot of them do. And the honeybees carry pollen from one plant to another, and they eat some of the pollen, they eat the nectar inside the flower, and they transfer this pollen from one plant to another. One honeybee can visit hundreds or even thousands of flowers every day. And it's not just for the bee, it's also good for the plant. This is red raspberry, and you can see these two flowers here are self-pollinated. They got, pollen from their own anthers on their own stigma, and they made fruit, and the fruit has seed in it, and that's okay. But this raspberry here, this is what raspberries look like when they're cross-pollinated, pollen from a different flower or pollen from a different plant. And you can see it's much more robust fruit. And we depend on bee pollinated foods for between friends ballpark 30% of the food that we eat. So their role in what we eat in our economy and our diets is huge. So we started to realize not too long ago this weird thing where we would find beehives where there were just no bees and there were no dead bodies and the bees had abandoned the hive and the queen was left and the larvae were left and a few young workers would be around, but it was just gone. And with no one to feed the queen and no one to feed the larvae, the colony just collapses and dies. And so once we found out that this was happening all over the place, they gave it a name, colony collapse disorder, or CCD, and it's killing honeybees. And when it kills the honeybees, then it's really hard on the plant populations because they're not being pollinated. And it's very hard on the animals, including ourselves, who depend on the food of the plants that are supposed to be pollinated. We're not 110% sure exactly why this is, but there's a lot of evidence that points to these pesticides called, I'm going to mess this up, but neonicotinoid pesticides. And they have some compounds that are really similar to nicotine. And we're thinking that those bees are maybe dying out in the field and are not returning back to their nest or their hive. And we're not really entirely sure why exactly that is, but over the past few years, in America, we've lost as much as 30% of our hives have collapsed, and in Europe, 20% of their hives have collapsed. So it's a pretty big deal financially. In the U.S., the stuff that bees pollinate's going to be worth ballpark maybe $212 billion, and so it's very very important that we understand what's going on there. So there's your introduction to flowers. Flowers are specialized reproductive structures of angiosperms. In the world of plants, we had our mosses, our bryophytes, then we had ferns, and then we had gymnosperms. And gymnosperms have no fruit. They just kind of throw their pollen to the wind like a pine tree and hope for the best. And then we have angiosperms, which have a fruit and seeds within the fruit. And we have pollinators generally that are carrying that pollen from one plant to another. And the flowers develop at the tips of the reproductive shoots, the end of the stem usually. And the flower parts are, at least from an evolutionary worldview, started off as modified leaves and have become increasingly more modified. And you can agree or disagree with that as you like, but these two terms you do want to know. They are the calyx, which is the outer whorl of the sepals, which are little green leaves that protect the flower when it's still in a bud, and the corolla, which is the outer whorl of petals, which is what primarily attracts the pollinator. I remember that a Toyota Corolla is so small that if it broke down, you could pedal it like Fred Flintstone. I know it's dumb, but it helps me, so if it helps you, use it. So male versus female flower parts. The male flower parts are the stamens, and the stamens consist of a filament with an anther, and the anther is what's going to be making the pollen, and the male gametophytes are the sperm cells that are living in that pollen. The female has a carpel, and a carpel consists of an ovary, a stigma, and a style. And all the carpels together are called the pistil. So the ovary is the base of the carpel. You have one or more ovules in the ovary. Depends on how many seeds are in the fruit that you're eating. Give you an idea of the number of ovules you started with. The ovule is a structure in which the female gametophytes produced. So it'd be basically the egg. That's what an ovule is. It's flower, eggs. People just don't like to think of it that way because it makes eating fruit weird. And then the stigma is the upper part of the carpel. It normally has a little bit of sticky substance on this tip of it to receive the pollen and help the pollen stick to it. And so here's your textbook flower. So the sepals are down here. They used to be a flower bud. They've since rolled back to expose the flower petals, which attract the pollinator. Those are the big pink-white things. We have the stamen right here, which is composed of a filament, this long, skinny white thing, and the anther, which produces lots and lots of pollen. Honeybee lands and tries to get the nectar down here. He gets all this pollen all over his belly and legs, flies off to the next flower. When he tries to get the pollen, or the nectar in that flower rather, some of that pollen brushes off onto the stigma of another flower's carpel. And on that stigma, there is a long, skinny style, and on the base of that style is the ovary. I remember this is called the style because, not to be discriminating against the guys, but generally I think girls have a better sense of style than guys. And so if that helps you, male reproductive structures, anthers, only male deer have antlers. Stamen has the word men in it, so these are male reproductive structures. And then style, because girls have better style. Sometimes, there might be some nice dressed guys, I don't know. I just kind of throw on whatever goes in my blue jeans. And that's how I remember, stigma, style, ovary for the female reproductive structures. And then in here we have one ovule with a little opening called a micropyle that those sperm cells have to get to. And so that's pretty much your flower. The base of the flower is called the receptacle. Sometimes it's called the peduncle, which is kind of a funny word. But yeah, so that's basically your flower. There's a lot of variety in types of flowers, not surprisingly. That picture I showed you had a single carpel. That's not always the case. You could have multiple carpels. You could have hundreds of carpels if you wanted to. You can also have varied ovary positions. Sometimes the ovary is above the rest of the flower. Sometimes the ovary is below the rest of the flower. Sometimes it's kind of buried right in the middle. And you can have different ovule positions. Of course, you could have a little cluster of ovules, a circle of ovules, bilaterally symmetrical ovules within ovaries that are shaped differently, which is not surprising. Our fruits have different shapes because their ovaries had different shapes. And we have different seed distributions in different fruits because they had different ovule distributions in different fruits. So here's some flower structures. There's lots of different ways flowers can form. Of course, it's not just the one flower at the tip of the stem like I showed you here. You can have a solitary flower with an irregular blossom. Here this is an orchid, a lady slipper orchid, which has bilateral symmetry and a very, very complicated flower shape. You can have inflorescences where the whole end of the stem is just flower, 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 flower everywhere. It makes kind of a high profile visibility for pollinators. And you can have a composite flower where one flower that we would pick up at a store is actually hundreds of flowers. Each of these is its own flower with its own reproductive organs. And then you can have an incomplete flower. This flower has no petals. So, time for some terminology. This is tricky. If your flower is incomplete, it's missing one of the four major structures. If it's complete, it has sepals, petals, stamens, carpels. That's complete. If it's missing any one of those, it's incomplete. Now that's different from perfect and imperfect. A perfect flower has both male and female reproductive structures on the same flower. An imperfect flower has just male structures or just female structures on each flower. So there's lots of different ways to classify these. So here is your imperfect flower. We have flowers occurring very closely together on these begonias, and we have female blossoms that just have carpels with no stamens, and then we have male blossoms that have no carpels and just stamens. So as long as they're close together, there's a pretty good chance that they'll be cross-fertilized by some sort of pollinator. So that's an imperfect flower example. Okay, so when we look at pollination, pollination and fertilization are two different things, and a lot of times students get these confused. Pollination is getting pollen to a stigma. You can have pollination without fertilization, but pollination is certainly the first step to it. So pollen gets to the stigma, that's pollination. If the sperm cells make the journey to the ovule and fertilize it to make a zygote, that's fertilization. Now, a pollination vector is an environmental agent that transfers pollen from one plant to another. Your book started with honeybees, but honeybees aren't the only pollinators. Of course, butterflies are pollinators, bats, beetles, flies, almost anything can be a pollinator, as long as it wants to eat some part of a flower. So, an animal pollinator can be insects or birds, and nectar is the sugary fluid that is generally what the pollinators are after. And so here's some examples of some pollinators: bats, bees, beetles, birds, butterflies, flies, and moths. And then it tells you about what the flower might look like for color, odor, nectar, if there's a lot of pollen or a little bit of pollen, the shape of the flower, and the examples. And you can kind of take a minute and read through these. They're kind of cool. For example, flies. Flies don't really care what color the flower is. It can be brown or purple, but a lot of times they're going to smell really bad because flies go to things like rotten meat and poop. So their flowers smell putrid. Nectar, they're normally not in it for the nectar. They think it's rotting meat, and then they find out that it's not actually there. So there's some examples that are kind of cool there. Bees, you get really bright colors for bees, things that smell pretty good, and a little bit of pollen. They don't need a whole lot. They need to have a decent landing pad because honeybees are rather large, and some examples of those. So just kind of some cool examples of different pollinators and different flowers. Like bird pollinated flowers need to have ample nectar because birds need a lot of food to keep flying. Here's an example: bird pollinating a flower, and these really long anthers are sticking a bunch of pollen to his neck and face. Here you have a bat, and that is actually eating out of the flower for a banana, and he's a pollinator for these bananas. And then of course you have insects. These moths here are pollinators as well. This is kind of a cool example. This is an orchid, and it is shaped, its petal is shaped like a female wasp, and it doesn't have to produce anything for nectar because the male wasp lands on the flower thinking it's a female, makes his attempt at copulating with it, and then when it leaves, he has pollen or pollinia stuck to his head, and then he will get tricked by another flower that he thinks is a girl and is not, and he will drop the pollinia off at the next flower. And so there you don't even need a nectar reward, but it does require a very, very close partnership in coevolution. The flower has to look just like the wasp, and that's a very risky method because with nectar you'll attract lots of people, but with a flower that looks like a girl wasp, you really only attract a couple wasps. Some other things that are cool about flowers is they can take advantage of things we can't even see. For example, here's a primrose that you and I would see. It's yellow, and that's about it. Bees can see ultraviolet light. So to a bee, I mean, there's no guess about where on this flower you need to land. There are lines, like a landing strip pointing exactly where that bee needs to be, right in the middle of that flower. So it's very easy for him to tell because he can see UV light. So that's kind of cool. Anyways, so we're going to stop there because that's 3 sections of the chapter, and we'll pick it up next time with life cycles. Thanks for your time.